All right. Hi, everyone. It is 4 p.m., so we'll slowly get started. I know that some people are trickling in because of the end of teaching. I'm so excited that all of you are here. Hi to all of my students. Thank you for coming. And feel free to take notes that you can sort of send in as part of that worksheet that or the survey that I'm having you do at the end. I, of course, forgot the thing that my notes are on, so I'm going to use my phone to try to approximate this. For those of you who don't know me, I am Darby Vickers. I am an assistant professor in the philosophy department and the new Elements chair of technology and humanities at the Humanities Center, and this is our inaugural event for the year. My predecessor, who is now a different Elements chair, Susie Babka, is here, which is really exciting, and I'm going to try to fill her shoes of doing a lot of these fun events where we get to talk to interesting people about AI and about technology more generally. So we're delighted to have Brian Merchant with us today. Among other things, he is a former technology columnist for the LA Times and has been recently doing work as a journalist for Wired. He also is the author of One Device, The Secret History of the iPhone, which came out in 2017, and his more recent book from 2023, Blood in the Machine, The Origins of the Rebellion Against Big Tech. It's a beautiful book, so you should get a copy if you haven't already. It is a really wonderful read. I have subjected my students to it, as well as the faculty reading group, and I hope that you all are enjoying it so far. I've gotten some really wonderful questions about it. We actually Brian and I met last year when he gave an interview at UCI, my alma mater, and I was really excited to bring him out to come speak to all of you today on campus. And he had a really horrendous time getting here, so we really appreciate that he managed to get here all in one piece. And this is actually a really timely moment. So those of you who are in my class know this because I've posted it on Canvas, but many of you may not know there was a big Senate hearing on AI regulation that happened on Tuesday. Actually, I think it started during our class period. You can watch that on YouTube, but it's a really sort of interesting moment for thinking critically about how we can create a better future for all of us with AI and automation in the future. And looking at the sort of historical origins of this from the Luddite revolution is a great way that we can get some interesting insights into this process. For those of you who have not read the book, this is a phenomenal book about the Luddite revolution and its implications for today. I'm going to start with a couple of questions to sort of situate anybody who has not read the book in what's going on, and then we'll ask some sort of more critical questions and try to get everything up to date since the book, I assume, was sort of finished in around 2022, right? So we have a little bit of time and a lot of technological development since then. So I wanted to sort of start off and just like ask you about the origins of the term Luddite and its change in meaning and how it's used today. And if you could just sort of give us the sort of premise that you started with in your book.
Yeah, well, thanks for all that. It's good to be here. I do love talking about the Luddites. So the Luddites, the word Luddite comes from Ned Ludd, who was this apocryphal figure, probably apocryphal. He may or may not have existed. If he did exist, he almost didn't exist in the capacity that he's like a legendary figure, right? It's so the Luddites were cloth workers. They were artisans. They were skilled workers, craftsmen, who were working around sort of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. They were like the largest working group, the industrial sort of base of workers in all of England, second only to agrarian workers. So there was hundreds and thousands of cloth workers. This is like, England's big industry. It's the driver of the Industrial Revolution. It's where mechanization starts to happen. So the short of it is as machines begin to sort of be embraced by entrepreneurs and factory owners and sort of the early capitalists. Capitalism isn't yet fully formed. It's sort of in the process of being forged at this moment. This new class starts to use machinery to organize work at the direct expense of skilled labor in the cottage industries. Where you have this system that's hundreds of years old, where craftsmen are working in their homes, they have a lot of autonomy. There are a lot of rules and regulations and norms that govern the way that they work, and these machines and the factory owners are basically tearing up these rules. They're setting up factories on the outside of town, and this is a time where economies aren't particularly sort of diversified in the way that a modern economy is. So if you have a factory set up on the edge of town and it's a wool weaving town or it's a wool finishing town, and that's the central industry of the town, and you start to hire child laborers to run these machines instead of skilled working people who rely on this work to feed their families and do that kind of things, then it becomes pretty clear to the working people what's going on. The factory owner is profiting at the direct expense of the working people. And this process plays out over the last decades of the 1700s and the early years of the 1800s. And I'm giving all this sort of preface to sort of just to make clear that these cloth workers, tried to deal with this for a long time. They went to Parliament. They tried to point out that the machine-owning class was breaking all these rules in the way that they were wielding technology. They were tearing up the social contract. People hated them. They were, if you became this kind of factory owner, it was you had to be willing to sort of earn the opprobrium of the local population. You had to be okay with being hated to make a lot of money because you were just making people poor. It was very clear the trade-offs here, and obviously the working people had no say in this. So at around 1809, Parliament finally just tears up all the regulations, says no minimum wage, no protections for the trade, no apprentice, nothing to govern this at all. It's the ball's in the entrepreneur's court, and this sort of is the final sort of hurdle that's cleared to give rise to sort of the factory system and the modern industrial system. And the Luddites become the Luddites when they have no options left. They've petitioned, they've protested, they've tried to talk it out with the industrialists, and there's no unions because it's illegal at the time to bargain collectively. It's literally illegal. So they have no options, and they organize in 1811 what becomes this sort of guerrilla uprising, where they start organizing themselves into military-like bands. They'll give a factory owner who they know has, X hundred number of looms in their factory, and they'll say, "We know you have 300 of the obnoxious machines," they'd call them. "If you take them down, all will be well. If you do not, you'll get a visit from Ned Ludd's army." And sure enough, they would, under the cover of night, hold up the overseer by gunpoint, and they'd go in and they'd smash the machines that were, again, only the machines that were doing the specific forms of automation that were threatening their jobs, that were taking their work, that were being run by child laborers. And they did this over and over again. Because it was this sort of distributed movement, it could be replicated. So Ned Ludd is again this sort of made-up figure that there was a legend that Ned Ludd was whipped by his master. He was an apprentice in Nottingham, and he got angry because he was being whipped and he was a child, and he took up his master's hammer and smashed it and fled into Sherwood Forest. There's a lot of speculation. Ned Ludd, Robin Hood, this is the same geographical region, same kind of history of sort of descent. So it definitely plugs right into the Robin Hood mythology. And the Luddites were like the Robin Hood and his merry men of the day. They were a true, popular movement. People cheered them in the streets. Officials would sometimes just stand by instead of calling the cops and watch them ransack a factory, watch them tear machines out of a caravan that was being shipped to where they were supposed to go, and then smash them in the street. They were truly, this righteous popular movement. And this is a very long-winded way of answering your question, maybe, but the reason that we now think of Luddites in this derogatory fashion is because the state recognized how potent this movement was, how popular it was, and pretty much immediately started setting about slandering them as backwards looking, as not being able to act in their own best interests, or being confused, or being angry at the existence of technology, right? If the word Luddite today is most often used as a derogatory epithet for somebody who reactionary, is a reactionary, kind of doesn't get technology, or is angry at it and just wants to destroy it, kind of as a knee-jerk reaction. It erases this entire history and context in which the Luddites, who knew better than anybody exactly how the technology was going to be used, and to their detriment, organized strategically in a popular movement to fight back against those who are exploiting them. They were technologists themselves. They were technicians. They were well experienced with the machinery of their day. So they were not anti-technology. They were anti-poverty. And it took the state, the full force of the state, and tens of thousands of troops who were mobilized to oppose them. It took updating the legal code to make it a crime punishable by death to smash a machine. And it took sort of the full force of the state's might to crush this, which is very, very interesting, because now we think of the Luddite as, oh, they're doomed, right? They're dumb. You're just opposing the inevitable march of progress. Well, we have this moment here where if there's a different reaction from the state, or if the Luddites win, maybe all of industrialization and the way that we develop and deploy technology looks a lot different today.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that's interesting because you often hear this term deployed against people today who are sort of in many ways the same people who are talked about as anti-progress by a lot of technologists. And it was particularly sort of fun to me that when you signed my book, that when I met you last, your sort of inscription was that the Luddites were right. And I think this is something that a bunch of the members of the faculty reading group got out of this as well. We're just like, oh, I actually really support this movement in a way that I didn't expect to from reading through that wonderful archival research that you sort of put into this book. So, awesome. I was going to ask about the basic strategy of the Luddites, but you ended up covering that. So I'm actually going to move on to ask, what ended up... So certainly the state ended up crushing them, and they were only able to sort of slow down the pace of that technological movement a little bit. But I know that you also say that there were certain things that were successful about the Luddite movement. So what kind of successes, despite the fact that they were crushed by the state, did they have?
Yeah. So there was at least 3 or 4 major sort of victories that they won. The first is in the short term. They did, there were some very short-term victories in that when they first sort of reared up, they actually did, get a lot of sort of support from a lot of the factory owners. There's a chapter in the book to where I just kind of try to go through and look at this through the eyes of sort of the entrepreneurs of the day who kind of feel like, well, a lot of them were okay with this old domestic system too. Maybe they're merchants where they're just, buying the cloth, selling it to the cloth workers, and then buying it back, and they like it that way. But then some of the other merchants or some of the other sort of master weavers start to buy a few of these automating machines, and then suddenly they can produce more cloth. And then they go, well, if they're doing it, then I got to do it too. You can kind of see just sort of, the logic of industrial capitalism sort of taking shape. And so a lot of them really kind of felt very conflicted about doing this because they knew that it would impact some of their neighbors adversely. But they also worried about, the health of their own business and being able to, pay their employees and do that kind of thing. So that's pretty relevant too, I think, to sort of the way that automation, continues to be deployed over the next 200 years. But they, a lot of them waved the white flag, and they said, okay, you know what, we didn't want any part of this in the first place, and we'll go back to paying the rates before the machinery. So they made some short-term victories in kind of keeping machines out of certain trades, and righting the ship in a few cases. In a few instances, like in Manchester, where the power loom was starting to gain hold, they probably bought themselves 10 to 20 years, and that may not sound like much, but it did give sort of like the trade groups a time to sort of better organize, to fortify themselves, and to prepare for the introduction of these machines. So real gains in the short term. Number two, they really, for maybe in the eyes of some historians, E.P. Thompson most notably, who puts them at the center of his really great history, The Making of the English Working Class. So Thompson and others argue that the Luddites, in this like moment of fury and sort of smashing the machines and getting all this press, and really sort of waging this popular crusade, helps sort of unite what for one of the first times true class solidarity, and gets people to think of themselves as having shared interests, where before you had a bunch of disparate trade groups and different parts of trade. Now everybody's waging this battle against a common opponent, and in this case, it's the capitalist, right? So you have the working class sort of emerging, and not just this recognition, this solidarity, but a lot of the sort of the bonds, the social bonds that are formed, go on to help in the reform movement to sort of abolish the bans on forming unions. So you get some real gains in the reform movement too, and you see this tactic inaugurated in other cases that are less famous now. Like there's after a couple decades after the Luddites, there was Captain Swing, and there are agricultural workers who used almost the same tactic with another mythical figure, and they were way more successful than the Luddites were. They were very poor agricultural workers, and they would smash the threshing machines that were being used to take their jobs, and that really kind of got industrialists to back off. And finally, number four is that it sort of ingrained this way of thinking critically about a new technology that may or may not be used by sort of the wealthy and the advantaged recklessly and without considering the social ramifications or the impacts on people. And this is most widely felt in the Romantic poets were huge fans of the Luddites. You had Percy Shelley. He had money sent to the Luddites after they were hung to their families to help them out. He was such a supporter. You see some of the themes in his poem Queen Mab kind of echo what the Luddites were doing. But most famously, probably, a tie for fame. Lord Byron gives his first speech in the House of Lords defending the Luddites when they were going to try to pass this bill that did end up passing to make it a capital crime to break a machine. And Byron gives this big thundering kind of speech in defense of the Luddites. He's from the district. He's from north of Nottingham, and that gets reprinted in all the papers. And it sort of underlines that how broad and how popular this sentiment is. But most famously and enduringly, Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein, based on sort of the example of the Luddites, and in part inspired by its themes. And she's finalizing the draft of Frankenstein as the last Luddites are being hung.
Yeah, and I want to get back to that sort of angle about the Percy Bysshe Shelley and Mary Shelley and Lord Byron in a minute. But first, 10 to 20 years is like almost a full generation's worth of work. So that actually seems like, especially today, that would be a huge victory.
Yeah, it was. I mean, they weren't, the power loom was, I think, the one that was it wasn't yet in super wide operation yet, but it was the one that it was the machine that could automate weaving, basically, right? It could which there were more weavers than any other any other cloth worker at the time. It was a huge trade, so it was the biggest threat. And it was kind of this looming threat for decades, and they finally start really trying to make the push at this moment. Again, I do a better job in the book trying like setting the table, but there's all these reasons why the Luddites emerge when they do. But the industrialists are really trying to push automation at this moment because there's a big there's a big crop failure, so food prices are high. There's a problem with this. One of the first sort of sanctions on export markets because England is at war with France, so they've banned export to a lot of the markets that anyone that's allied with France, like the United States, which was a huge export market. So the trade is suffering, and then the industrialists are trying to automate, into this void while the trade is at a point of weakness. And so the Luddites, really rising up then and kind of pushing back on the power looms was probably most effective there because it wasn't widely in use.
Yeah, and for anybody who's read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is a wonderful novel, it's really fun because that's set in the same period, and reading the two sort of sides of the more the history that's more focused on the Napoleonic Wars in England, and then seeing what's going on back home is a really interesting contrast for me because I'm a huge nerd. So one of the things I also wanted to sort of ask you to weave in before I'm going to sort of transition into more contemporary stuff is just can you tell us how this was related to the Chartist movement? Because there's a sort of really interesting idea of the banning labor unions and the way that the sort of push for democracy and more rights for the populace was intersecting with some of the sort of concerns about automation. And we can maybe think about what's going on in democracy today as well through some of these kinds of things.
Yeah, you can see there's it's actually a big question, and you have this question that has been sort of debated in various periods ever since this happened. But how much energy do we put into just opposing these machines and sort of really trying to do a rearguard action because we know that they're coming, and then try to protect our trade and protect our way of life and smash them in this case to sort of or how much do we try to go the reform route? And again, because Luddites are so decentralized, the Luddism in different regions has very different characters, and in Manchester you really see more of kind of a towing of the line of the sort of a reform movement where there's a really much more political edge. And this is something that since historians have been looking at the Luddites, they have been debating how much of a political sort of character they had, and it is really hard to discern because again, if they got caught, they were hung, so they didn't leave a big paper trail. But you do sort of start to see a lot of the people again who are kind of activated by these movements. Gravener Henson, who we follow in the book, is probably both actually doing the midnight raids and leading some Luddite parties surreptitiously, but then by day he's going and lobbying Parliament for actual reform. So you have a lot of these Luddite cells who are come together to sort of resist the machines, and then you have a lot of people there's a lot of sort of older from the previous generation like Tom Paine, sort of people who are pushing for more durable political reform. So they do start to interact. It's really hard to say. Historians would probably kind of bristle at sort of trying to determine how or any sort of allegation that that there was a big causation, but there is a lot of overlap, and a lot of the same issues are being discussed, and this issue of exploitation and of sort of a loss of economic and property rights, and a loss of being sort of helpless before the formation of this new economic model, this new industrial economic model. And so, yeah, it certainly seems to me that a lot of the Chartism, can, if not has its direct roots, but it overlaps and is sort of energized by what the Luddites were doing. And yeah, Chartism isn't too long after, so it certainly follows in that tradition, which and it was also quite, violently opposed by the state, of course.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Some of the they really crushed that movement pretty brutally.
A lot of getting crushed in history.
So I'm actually going to turn it over to a couple of really wonderful student questions that I got. If I'm not asking your question, students, it's not because it wasn't good, but it may be because it didn't sort of follow the train that I was thinking. But the first question comes from Taylor Erickson, and I'm going to read it out pretty directly. So in the introduction to Blood in the Machine, we read about events that took place in the winter of 1812 in England. What seems interesting about the events that took place was the denial of the machines. It's understood that many of the common people resisted machines specifically because tech titans were using them to replace the need for labor. Companies used automation to replace labor seems to be the trend that we're seeing today. But from what I have seen, people seem to embrace these new ideas and advances in technology rather than resist them. Why is it that people seem to be more accepting today than the people during the winter of 1812?
I mean, it really just depends on who you're talking to, right? I mean, I think, you talk to illustrators and artists and writers and copywriters and journalists and folks like that, and they're going to probably have a much more negative view of the current AI trend right now. But I think the short answer is that, and one of the reasons that I wrote this book was that you can kind of experience these events through the eyes of people who are sort of seeing this happen, this trend happen for the first time or one of the first times with clear eyes, and in a slightly less complicated setting. Not that it's it's like less economically complicated. And you can kind of, it makes it a little bit starker to see sort of the moral judgments that they were making about what was happening. So if you have a situation now, for instance, where there's an AI system or a service that can, generate if you're at an illustration or an image for 20 cents or something, and you used to, a company maybe used to pay somebody $250 to illustrate, their slide deck or whatever. You can kind of ask, what's going on here? What is when you probably, I don't know if you've seen the artists kind of oppose this stuff, or they are very much up in arms. There's a lot of class action lawsuits. There's a lot of organizing where it's possible. The Animation Guild is sort of out in the streets right now because
they actually contacted me right before your book came out about the Luddites and about ethics around AI, and I recommended this to them. So hopefully they got in touch with you.
Good, yeah. So there is, again, it kind of depends on who you're talking to. But so the Luddites hadn't had 200 years of this idea that technology equals progress, that all innovation is assumed to be good, sort of by default. And this is something that a lot of industrial forces and tech companies most recently have put a lot of work into cultivating. I've been a tech journalist for 15 years, and for the first 5 or 6 years or so, maybe more, that I was entering the field at a time where the norm was you cover an event, Apple says here's a new product, and it was just expected that journalists would kind of say, oh, how cool, what can it do, what can it do, it's so affordable, it's so great. Or when Uber comes out and the sharing economy, oh, how nice, how great. We have this expectation that technology has some inherent quality of progress or benevolence sort of associated to it. And I think the last 5 or 6 years especially have done a lot to sort of erode that assumption when the behavior of companies like Facebook and Meta Amazon and how they treat their workers, and Uber, and what we've seen with declining wages at a lot of the tech companies, and things have at least gotten more complicated. So until very recently, the assumption was if a tech company's doing something, then yeah, it's kind of for the greater good. And these assumptions went rather and criminally unchallenged, at least in the mainstream press. There were a lot of academics and critics doing great work. It just didn't sort of reach sort of the mainstream level. It still has trouble reaching the mainstream level. For instance, Oprah does her AI special last week. Who does she have on? Does she have on, people thinking about AI ethics? Does she have on labor leaders who are actually running into this stuff? Does she have on workers who have to deal with AI coming down? No, she has on the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman. She has Bill Gates, who has, quite a large interest in AI, and no workers, no real critical voices. So it's still this sort of knee-jerk assumption that we have is that technology must be progress, and I think again goes part and parcel with how hard the state works. It's not always called Luddites, but again, if you challenge this, if you stand up and say, like, I don't know about this, then you risk kind of being called backwards looking or foolish or a Luddite, and in the derogatory sense. So it became very hard, I think, for people to sort of effectively, register their complaints, to the point where I talked to a Teamsters leader, and he said, up until recently, we have felt uncomfortable sort of challenging a lot of the things that are clearly bad for our workforces, right? Like self-driving trucks, that risk putting, Teamster workers out of, because they don't want to risk, being painted as backwards looking or dummies or people who just don't understand the technology, when we can have really truly valid complaints with what a tech company is doing or technology is doing, without being backwards looking. And I do feel like we've kind of crossed the threshold, and now more people are sort of comfortable saying, like, AI sucks, it's a plagiarism machine, it's this or whatever. There's actually maybe more cultural currency with sort of being anti-AI, but I know that's a whole nother can of worms. But yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it gets to the heart of why I did the book. I keep looking at you. Did you ask the question? Okay, good. Yeah. If you didn't, you're probably like, why is he staring at me? Yeah.
Yes. So actually, this was something that struck me as I was rereading your book, and sort of hits on something in your answer, which is you talk about the origins of the word entrepreneur, how it was like a pretty new term at this time and comes out of a French scholar looking at Adam Smith. Is that right?
Yeah, after post-Smith, yes, I think. Yeah.
And it sort of meant like adventurer, and that was a very new term. And today we think of entrepreneurs as the sort of basis of the economy, and so that may, in part, be a bit of the difference in perspective. And that was really cool, because I had not thought of that.
Yeah, it was just the entrepreneur was just sort of emerging as a term. It certainly hadn't yet been romanticized. And it hadn't been sort of it was part of the additional economic theory that somebody had made to sort of supplement Smith, because he thought he needed a theory for how like new value gets created, who are the people that take risks, and then it calls them adventurers. And it actually, I think the term like dates, well, that's a bit too big of a tangent, but yeah,
go for it.
No, suffice to say that it was a new. It was a new sort of idea, and it was. This is also a big part of the story. It's that it wasn't broadly sort of normalized quite yet, but Adam Smith and laissez-faire economics had been fully sort of embraced by a certain swath of the elites who were really, really into it at the end, and it was pretty much despised by the working people. They would a couple times in the book you'll hear sort of the workers or Gravener Henson sort of refer to people derisively as like friends of Adam Smith, people who, because it's being his economic theory is being used to justify things like, removing all the trade regulations, removing all the laws that were put in place to sort of regulate the cloth industry. It was helping to keep child labor out. It was helping to, sort of keep stable the number of people that could be employed in the industry, keep the quality high, the thread count high, so that they could fetch good prices and for their wares pre-machinery. And after the machinery came, you see this argument being made that echoes a lot of like what the AI companies or the especially the gig work companies argue, that these new rules don't apply anymore. The old rules don't apply anymore. We have new machines. It's a new era. We just forget about them. We're not a taxi company. We're Uber. You're not hailing a cab. You're doing peer-to-peer, in contractor rider, relationships here. We're not a tech platform. We're not a taxi service. We're a tech platform. And they use that logic to get around the taxi code in so many cities until they basically kind of had municipalities waving the white flag and saying, okay, fine, it actually, you win. You're too big to get out of here, and that's what a lot of the entrepreneurs basically did in the first decade of the 1800s. They just moved fast and broke things until they were too big to oppose through regulation or through reform, and the Luddites had to take up their hammers.
Including some gruesome descriptions of the children that fell into the machines, by the way, in sections that I did not have you read for class, but are really worth reading, very powerful. Yeah. So, sort of speaking of this, one of the things that people have done to protest, like Waymo, for example, the automated rideshare company, is there are ways that you can prevent the cars from moving by like putting cones on top of them, like traffic cones and things. And this leads into my one of the other student questions. This student asked to remain anonymous. So how can we learn from the Luddites of the Industrial Revolution and reframe this term into one that can be productive in holding developers of technology accountable? And where's the line drawn between taking initiative to slow the overwhelming speed of developing technology and flat-out vandalization or destruction of property? And what, if any, protections would people have for standing up for a more gradual introduction of new tech?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is, in my opinion, like the $1 million question. How do we do that? How do we facilitate a system where more people have an opportunity to sort of offer their genuine input or be empowered to sort of say how a technology that is being imposed on them will function or work. It is interesting that as I was, I think the year before my book came out, Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, came out, and that's sort of also, interrogating this question of when is sabotage morally justified, and could it be that in the case of the climate crisis that sabotaging fossil fuel infrastructure is the morally justified option? I think we are so far away from that in terms of technology that we do have all these tools that the Luddites did not have. We have organized labor. We have nominally, a democracy where we can call for regulation on certain things. We have, vectors to facilitate the public opinion on these things. It's oftentimes still that's not enough right now. These companies are so well capitalized. They have so much power, so much influence, and so much wealth that they can just, sort of build things the way that they want to build them and then foist them on the public anyways. But I do think that there are green shoots of ways that we can effectively push back. And I think the answer, the thing that I always sort of gravitate back towards is the Luddites, again, they were not against the technology itself, right? This technology itself it did allow stuff to be produced faster, and it was at a lower quality. But what was really offensive to them was that it was being used to sort of, again, take work away from them without their say, and to establish a norm where you would have precarious labor doing that job, like a child or a migrant worker, or somebody that they could get away with paying a lot less. For a long time, it just was children. They had pipelines set up from orphanages to get fresh children to work in the factories. So it's not the machinery, it's not the equipment, it's the social formation. The Luddites really wanted, more than anything, a seat at the table. You can imagine how different things would be if these entrepreneurs came into the wool making towns and said, we have this new machinery. I bet if we put our heads together, we could find a way to mutually benefit, right? But that's not the way that sort of entrepreneurial capitalism dictates things get developed. No, instead, you have somebody setting up their factory on the outside of town, contra your interests, trying to develop as fast as they can to put you out of business. It's very adversarial. So the challenge today is how do we sort of bridge some of these gaps? How do we find a way to develop and deploy technology in a way that is less top? I mean, right now it's the ultimate top down. It's all Silicon Valley is getting all the venture capital, getting all of the institutional the power behind their projects, and they're able to sort of develop technology the way that they want to. We have limited options on how to sort of to push back against those things. Again, we can yell about it on Twitter. If we're part of a union, we can sort of organize. And this remains the best way right now for people to sort of push back against the way AI is being used in the workplace. If you have a union, you can kind of say, if in our contract, we want to guarantee that you're not going to use it for this reason. That's what the WGA did. They were on strike last year. You probably remember the screenwriters. And one of their biggest sticking points was that they wanted a clause in the contract that said you cannot use AI to generate a script. The studios can't do that. The bosses can't do that. If it's okay with you guys to use AI, then if anyone's going to make that call, it's going to be the worker. It's going to be us. It's going to be part of our labor process. And kind of remarkably, they won that. They won that clause in their contract as part of their 5-year contract with the studios. So it's, again, this social agreement that that AI is not going to be used in a way that's going to adversely affect them. Because, again, they know they're not worried that the AI is going to churn out the next, Steven Spielberg script, or they know that what's going to happen is the AI is going to churn out something that sucks, and that the studios are going to pay them less to fix it up, and they're going to get a rewrite fee, not a credit for writing the entire script. They're going to not get residuals. So it's a way that the bosses can use technology to break down a contract, just like the bosses were using technology as a way to break down social contracts in the Luddites' day. And they push back. Not everybody can do that, because the WGA is a lot of power in the industry. It's one of the few sort of areas in the modern American economy where there's high union density, and they can withhold their labor and get a solid concession. The Animation Guild is trying to do the same thing right now. They're in talks with the AMPTP, which is the studio lobbying group. And I just last night I had a call with the musicians alliance, the musicians workers alliance. They're worried about a lot of the same things, and we are seeing these interesting bits of legislation, a lot of which hinge on consent. Right, so it's like I think California just passed a law that if a company is going to use like a vocal sample of you, or they want to use AI, then by law now they must get consent. So they can't just train you use whatever trained available samples of your voice if you're a voice actor, or you just are a public figure, and then use that. So now there's a penalty of law against that. So there are interesting ways that this is being litigated right now, but it all comes down to this question of how do we more democratically sort of develop or engage with technology that is currently being built and sold for profit, for a lot of profit, by a relatively small handful of folks in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and to sort of bring up the writers and the animators and the musicians and things like that, one of the things that really struck me when I reread this book over the summer was the role that humanists played in promoting the cause of the Luddites, right? You talk, as you have already, about Lord Byron's work in the Luddite cause, and I particularly liked this quote, hold on a second, on page 336. Between the Ode to the Framebreakers, which Byron published to lampoon and lament Richard Ryder's efforts to turn Luddism into a capital crime, and his maiden speech in the House of Lords, Byron had done more than any other figure in popular culture to lend support to the machine breakers' struggle. He also asked that his publisher reprint his anti-regent poem, Tears of a Weeping Princess, this time with his name attached a year after it ran anonymously. And in 1816, he would complete his trilogy of pro-Luddite works, and you sort of reproduce some of the poems here and then talk about how other people in his orbit ended up doing similar things. And I'm wondering what the role of humanists today, alongside, you know, the labor unions that unite those humanists, like the Writers Guild and the Musicians Guild, can do to try to raise awareness or maybe try to do sort of similar things in supporting anti-technology movements that we saw in this previous era.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we already kind of have sort of culture on the side of the humans, right? I mean, since Frankenstein, you know, the inaugural, tech entrepreneurs, product seeks out to, ruins the world and seeks out to destroy him. We've had many iterations of this story, and it is almost not fitting, but it's still resonant. I just wrote a story about Mike Rianda, who directed a kids movie called The Mitchells versus the Machines. Anybody seen this movie? It's really cute movie. I have kids, so if you have kids, you're much more likely to have seen it. But basically, it's a story about a tech CEO who unleashes this new update that turns all the phones into automatons that enslave all of humanity, and this family of weirdos has to sort of fight back and try to free the humans from enslavement by the machines. And the reason they can do that is that the dad is like a survivalist who makes them all carry screwdrivers around in their pockets with them at all times, so they can actually get in the machines and fix them. But anyways, the director of this movie has become a leading figure in the Animators Guild struggle against the Hollywood bosses who want to be able to use AI to animate different pieces of the process to generate storyboard art or environment art or even automate whatever they can in the CGI process. And so you have an industry that is really vulnerable and perhaps existentially threatened by AI. And so you have this really interesting example of somebody who made this cultural product that's basically anti-AI, now living out the theme of his story. Another example, when I would go down and talk to people on the picket lines last year, that during the SAG, the actors and the writers strikes, a lot of them would mention this Black Mirror episode that had just come out at the same time, in which it turns out that spoiler alert, I guess, but it's an algorithm that basically is using AI to auto-generate a new episode for you based on things that you've seen. I forget what it's called. Joan is awful.
Joan is awful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really. So they would be saying they're like, this is happening for real, and it gave them this this context, this cultural context to sort of further their claims. So I would say that a lot of this is out there already, and that sort of cultural contexts are already sort of just kind of sitting there and are sort of very exploitable by workers who want to sort of make this point. and I think that it's pretty successful. I don't know. I don't know. It kind of varies room to room, but there's a lot of negative sentiment around the AI companies, especially since they're being built. These AI systems are being built a lot of the times by the same companies that built the last generation of social media platforms that have allowed misinformation and toxicity and all kinds of harassment to sort of run rampant on their platform. So like we want to trust these guys to bring on the AI revolution. I don't know. I think it's going to be a really interesting couple of years, just to say the least. But I do think, culture is already sympathetic to the humans in the humans versus AI struggle.
Yeah, and I mean, something also that was really interesting in the sort of cultural things is I'm sure many of you read Frankenstein in high school, which is also the last time that I read Frankenstein. And for whatever reason, in my high school brain, Dr. Frankenstein was a middle-aged man, right?
He's a tech bro.
Right, and that was wild when I was rereading this, was he's this like young 20-something entrepreneur who wants to show off and is playing with technology he doesn't understand to try to make a name for himself in this scientific community that he's beginning to join. And that really stood out to me, as well as the sort of movement from us thinking about the erudite, incredibly sort of like critical thinking Frankenstein monster that we see represented in the book, and then this sort of dull monster that we see represented in the movies. So I'm just sort of interested in like thoughts that you had about both of those pieces and what, Frankenstein has done or could do potentially if we, all re-engaged with it for our sort of culture right now.
Yeah, I loved rereading. I reread it for the book, and I also that was the biggest thing that surprised me too, because we have like the film sort of version of Frankenstein. He's that lumbering sort of he's like an imbecile. He can't really speak. In the book, again, and this does sync up again with sort of popular portrayals of Luddism too, and again keeping in mind that Frankenstein was inspired in large part by the Luddite uprisings. But in the book, Frankenstein is really eloquent. He articulates his case extremely well. Repeatedly, he keeps trying to track down his creator and say, "You made me. I don't know what to do. I'm lonely. I need companionship. I need the things that a human needs." And Victor Frankenstein just repeatedly just says, "Get lost," and kind of literally runs away from the problem. So the parallels are many now to pick your modern tech guy and creating a problem and then kind of paying lip service to it. He even says like, "Oh yeah, I'll make you a companion and then you won't be lonely anymore." And he says, "No, I'm not going to do that." And then he abandons it and sort of keeps fleeing. So it's only the last resort that Frankenstein sort of resorts to this campaign of terror. But yeah, I mean, I think the tale of Frankenstein is so long. You can look at the Terminator movies is a really relevant one where but I think we're still just drawing from that well, and it is still so resonant.
Yeah, and particularly, I don't know if anybody's seen this because it's a bit of a cult thing, but Joss Whedon had a show called Dollhouse, and there's a character named Topher Brink in it who is exactly this, right? He's figured out how to reconfigure the architecture in the brain so that you can upload new sort of programs to it, and he doesn't think about the consequences of any of that until he causes some terrible things to happen. So yeah, it's a really sort of powerful image in thinking about how the humanities can sort of help in this struggle. Another student who asked to remain anonymous asked, "What do you believe are the essential steps that we as a society can take to establish a sort of healthier relationship with this development of artificial intelligence?" I know that's a big question, so maybe just like a couple of things that would be useful.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much happening in this space at any given time. It is just it's hard for me to. It's my job to keep up with this stuff, and it's hard to do it sometimes. But yeah, but number one is having an information base about what's going on here. Number two is recognizing the incentives here and what's actually at play, and that is that these tech companies are trying to sell a product. I've seen a lot of highfalutin marketing schemes from Silicon Valley over the last 15 or 20 years. This is the wildest for sure, because before they even had a product, we're talking about AGI. We're talking about this artificial intelligence that's going to become all powerful, and is it going to enslave humanity, or is it going to help us out? And we just blew past all of the actionable sort of elements that we need to be really critical about, like how is this going to affect labor? What is the environmental cost of this? How much, misinformation and is this going to give rise to? Which are the immediate concerns. So, number three, the biggest one I would say is if, especially, you're in the workplace, or you're entering a workplace, is proactively thinking about how you would like to see AI used, or the ways that it might be used. As students, I think the annals of engagement, there are many. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see protests and things like that pretty soon, and there already have been on the labor end of things. But yeah, proactively trying to think about mechanisms for building engagement with this stuff. I think coalition building right now. Right now as students, it's not really like sort of like, the climate movement where there are great orgs out there doing stuff that you can donate to. It's more about, I feel, having the faculties to think about this stuff critically, being ready for because going into the workforce, AI, if you go into the workforce the next 2 years, you're going to be hearing about AI. Your boss wants you to use AI to do this. Your boss wants you to start doing AI in this way because maybe they don't need this older employee anymore. And we need to start thinking about these ethical questions about how it's being used. And having more dialogue about that. So yeah, it's a little more nebulous than I think some issues, especially as students. But I think we are in a really interesting period where it's really ripe for pushing back on some of the more exploitative uses of this stuff, and the needle can be moved. I do think that it's different than the Uber period, the Google period, the Apple period, in that they're entering the headwinds that are much more hostile to them than in the past. So if there's something that these companies are doing, which in my view they're doing quite a many things that are rather unethical, then I think legislation, popular organizing, and just public outcry can go a long way.
So one more question just before I open it up to the room, because lots of students have really good questions that I didn't ask for them and that they should get a chance to ask, as well as anybody else who's here. So I was wondering, since the book came out in 2023 and presumably you stopped writing it sometime mid-2022, I wanted to hear, given that things have changed so much, what has changed since then, and have any of your views changed? In particular, I was reading about the Andrew Yang campaign, and then seeing some of the much more sort of pro-technology things that he's posted more recently on LinkedIn. I was interested in just like hearing what your thoughts were about some of the political figures that we're pushing back, as well as just like anything else that's developed that's changed your mind.
Yeah, I've probably gotten the most pushback for including Andrew Yang in this book, and I tried. I feel like I didn't do it hard enough, but there's also his sort of historical analog is this guy Robert Owen, who I think had his heart in the right place. He was a wealthy factory owner, and his solution to all the ills that the Industrial Revolution was causing all of this, the child labor, the labor exploitation, all of the damage that was clearly being done to workers by having to work in these industrial settings. His solution was to, just make the factories better and to make them these sort of paternalistic, worker, sort of havens where people would get education. They would have to work less. There'd be no child labor, and you'd build these cities of places where there'd be fair work, and everybody would benefit more from and he went around sort of touting this plan, but it was very paternalistic, very top down, just give the benevolent industrialists the resources and they'll solve the problems. And so Andrew Yang, he was on the campaign trail when I was writing the book, and his thing that he hit on a lot was automation, and he was really one of the only ones who was talking about this in these terms. And I just thought it was interesting that he was bringing it up, and he had this example. He went on Joe Rogan and talked about how he thought that truck drivers were on the brink of being automated, and once they were automated, that they would gave this example. They would barricade the highways and try to fight back against people who were taking their jobs or something. So it was more about the language and the way that he was using it. I'd never meant to make him a positive figure. In fact, it's clearly he's just turned out to be quite an opportunist, and was just sort of riding headwinds that he felt might have been beneficial or made for good sound bites or something. But there are other political figures, in the book, people like the gig workers rising, who are still continuing to do good work, trying to organize one of the most difficult to organize sectors of work, gig app workers. Amazon labor union has kind of they've got a ton of pushback, but they won an incredible victory. Chris Smalls, who was one of the leaders in that first drive, has also turned out to be somewhat of a controversial figure, but I think the ALU has teamed up with the Teamsters, and they're kind of back in action. So there are headwinds that I feel like were identified, and political leaders, at least on that organizing level, that are continuing to do interesting things, and some of that momentum is still in place. But if anything, the way that I think about technology and the way that I think the dangers of allowing a relatively comparatively small group of people dictate the way that technology is going to impact workers has, if anything, been borne out even more clearly with the AI boom, where you have this corollary of skilled workers who are facing this assault on their livelihoods, so that comparatively few people can profit.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Question.